Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I've got some haunted house stories for you, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This story happened to me around 20 years ago, when I was still a sophomore in high school. My aunt and uncle had a 3-story condo that was always kind of off. It wasn't a particularly old or creepy looking building, in my recollection, but as soon as you set foot inside, there was something in the air that reeked of something isn't right. For a little background, the condo's first floor held the living and dining areas, the kitchen, and the back door that led to a small patio. The second story was the master bedroom, 2 guest rooms, a bathroom, and a little nook for the washer and dryer. The third floor was a game room with several old video game consoles like Atari Jaguar and Sega Genesis, with my uncle's Star Trek collection in one corner and a door that led you to the attic crawl space. It also had a pull-out sofa sleeper for guests. This layout information is relevant for later. As I grew up, we visited the condo many times. The entire building had an odd aura to it, but this all culminated on the 3rd floor. When you walked over the final stair up to the 3rd floor, the air just changed, where on the 2nd floor you could hear the sounds of family visiting downstairs and outside traffic. On the 3rd, it was dead silent. The air was heavy and thick. No sounds permeated here, and you were always left with a feeling of being stared at or watched, almost as if you were intruding there. Being kids, my cousins and I would often go up to the 3rd floor to play video games. However, we never went up there alone, and absolutely never went up at night. It was just one of those places that felt like it was on a different plane of existence, its own pocket dimension of silence and gloom. My family had seen and heard things in that condo on multiple occasions. It was common knowledge that one could hear footsteps pacing up and down the stairs at night. You would see figures out of the corner of your eye, doors would open and close despite being locked, objects would move, that sort of thing. One morning I woke up before the adults to find a trail of pennies lying from end to end from the 3rd floor all the way down to the kitchen. I remember being a little unsettled by this, but not particularly afraid. I was more interested in free money and greedily put the pennies in a Ziploc bag to take them home with me. Because these goings-on were relatively benign in nature, my family assumed it to be the spirit of my late grandfather, who was the mischievous sort in life, watching over the house at night. Fast forward to my teenage years. My uncle died suddenly, and so a flood of tight-knit family descended on the condo to comfort my aunt and attend my uncle's funeral. Because there were so many people staying in the condo, my mum, dad, sister and I were relegated to sleeping upstairs on the 3rd floor. I was creeped out, but figured, hey, how bad could it be? Boy, was I in for a surprise. The day of the funeral came and we all attended the wake, after which the family gathered outside to comfort my aunt, who was sobbing uncontrollably at the loss of her husband. I remember the sound being a gut-wrenching, heartbreaking cry of pure despair. It hurt to listen to, so I quickly retreated from the crowd of onlookers and went to find my cousins, who were ready to leave. Little did I know all hell was about to break loose. We got back to the condo and everyone wept and shared stories of my uncle. After some time, we all grew tired and decided it was time for bed. I slept on the sofa while my mum and dad and little sister all shared an air mattress down on the floor by the foot of the sofa. What I remember most about that night was the cold. I startled awake in the middle of the night, unsure of what had woken me, only to be greeted by the most bone-biting, skin-saturating cold I've ever felt in my life. It permeated the entire 3rd floor, soaking through my clothes and into my body. I shuddered and pulled the blanket tighter around me. I remember being puzzled by the cold, as the 3rd floor usually got uncomfortably warm. I lay there shivering for a few minutes, and then I heard it. The sound I heard is hard to describe, but it's probably best described as something trying its best to mimic my aunt's sobbing from earlier. It was a dry, raspy voice, crying and choking and carrying on in a mocking tone, and it was very loud. I mean ear-splittingly loud. It was coming from the far corner of the room, over by the crawl space door. I froze in terror. What on earth was going on? Was this some kind of an entity? I peeked over the edge of my blanket and gazed into the darkness at the corner of the room. But of course, nothing was there. My mother, having had past experiences with paranormal things, had once told me that if anything scary ever happened like that, to ignore it, and it would go away. So that's exactly what I tried to do. I squinted my eyes shut and pretended to be asleep. When that didn't work, I tried covering my head with the couch cushion to blot out the sound. That didn't work either. The sound stayed as loud as it had been, almost as if it were coming from inside my own head. I lay like that for what seemed like minutes, but was probably only 45 seconds or so, when another noise grabbed my attention, the rustling of blankets. I peered out from under my own blankets to see my mother had bolted up on the mattress. She looked left and right with confusion, then jumped up and ran down the stairs to the second floor. My father and sister were still sound asleep. This next part is what my mum told me after she ran down the stairs. When my mum hit the second floor, she immediately opened the master bedroom, thinking my aunt was awake and crying. But nope, sound asleep. My mum could still hear the wailing, so she checked all the other rooms on the second floor and everyone was asleep. Confused, she stood at the bottom of the stairs, leading up to the third floor, and listened to the wailing. Meanwhile, my fear had given way to my curiosity, glancing cautiously over towards the corner where the sound was coming from. I leaned over the banister and gazed down to the second floor, and I could see the hall light downstairs, and Mum looked bewildered at the bottom of the steps. "Mum?" She nearly jumped out her skin. Her head snapped up to look at me. "Are you looking for the wailing sound?" My mum's eyes widened. "You heard it too?" I nodded. "But why isn't anyone else waking up?" she called up. I shrugged. She then turned away from me and headed down towards the stairs leading to the first floor. As she rounded the corner towards the first floor, she ran headlong into my little cousin. He was wide-eyed, in tears and shaking. My mum asked him what was wrong, and he said that it was coming to get him. My mum began to ask what was coming to get him when she saw it. A shadow, humanoid, came lurching up the steps towards them, blacker than the darkness surrounding it. As it approached, it began to morph, to grow, and it was now standing at 8 feet tall, lunging up the remaining stairs, making a horrible sound as it came. My mum grabbed my cousin and began sprinting up the stairs, the shadow stomping just behind her. This cacophony caught my attention, and now, completely ignoring the wailing in the room with me, I craned my neck over the banister to see what was going on. I saw Mum sliding around the corner towards the third floor stairs, a flood of shade and darkness filling the hallway behind her. My little cousin was screaming and clutching at her neck as she ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "Mum, Mum," I cried. "It's right behind you." She obliged and came flying up the final few steps towards the third floor. As soon as she cleared the landing, the wailing completely stopped, cut off like someone pulling the plug on a speaker. She leapt into the air mattress with my cousin, and I abandoned all pretense of maturity and clambered onto the mattress with them. We all sat there huddled in abject terror, staring into the darkness of the staircase, but nothing came. No shadow, no wailing, nothing. That's when the stomping started. Up and down the stairs it went, over and over, rattling the knickknacks on the walls, vibrating to the floors. Still no one woke up, and after several minutes of this, the footsteps reached the third floor and stopped dead. The temperature in the room immediately started to plummet. My mum had clearly had enough. She started violently waking up my father. "Wake up!" she snarled at him. When my dad woke up, everything got quiet again. He was groggy and annoyed and asked us what we were doing. We explained what had happened, and my cousin, still crying in my mother's arms, as he looked at us skeptically, but listened intently with us for any sounds in the house. Sounds never came for the rest of the night, but none of us really slept after that. In the morning, my cousin, still visibly shaken, explained to us what had happened before Mum found him. He said he heard a voice calling him from downstairs and thought his father, my late uncle, had returned somehow. He was young and I don't think he understood the permanence of death, and when he went down to investigate, he said he ran into the shadow and that it was too big to be my daddy. I don't know what exactly happened that night. I've read about shadow people, about jinn, about demons, but nothing quite matches the being we saw that night. If anyone has a good answer or has run into an entity like this, I would love to hear about it. This happened right after my wife and I got married and moved to Idaho. We had just settled into our new apartment and were getting used to our routine. One night we were lying in bed. My wife had fallen asleep beside me, but I was still awake. I often stayed up late reading comic books, sometimes for hours on end, and this night was no different. I believe I was reading a Spider-Man series. Our bed was positioned along the wall where the door was, so I had a clear view of it from where I was laying. As I read, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being watched. At first I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There above the doorframe was what seemed to be a black shadow peeking at me. It looked as if it was standing upside down on the living room ceiling, staring directly into our bedroom. It reminded me of a bat hanging upside down, its head poking in the room. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, convinced that I was just seeing things. But when I looked again, it was still there, its dark form unmistakable. Being nearsighted, I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it was looking at me. It felt almost like it was playing a game of peekaboo, ducking out of sight when I focused on it, only to reappear moments later. The room felt colder, and a chill ran down my spine. My breathing grew shallow, and my heart pounded in my chest. I got that feeling that feels like someone dropped a hot rock in my stomach, and I stared at it in shock, unable to move or look away. My mind raced, trying to make sense of whatever I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of my imagination? However, after a few moments of making sure I was lucid, I knew it was real. The way it moved, the way it seemed aware of my presence, convinced me that it was no illusion. Desperately, I reached over and shook my wife, trying to wake her up. "Annie, wake up!" She began to stir, and the shadow slowly moved its head up and disappeared into the darkness of the living room. My wife groggily asked what was wrong, but I could tell she sensed the fear in my voice. I explained what I had seen, my voice trembling. She was too terrified to even look herself, but it wouldn't have mattered anyway, as whatever entity it was had already vanished. It felt like it was playing with me. We lay there, in the silent darkness. Neither of us felt safe. I said a prayer for peace, asking for protection and strength, and slowly my nerves began to calm down, and eventually we managed to fall asleep, though it was a restless night. The next day I didn't waste any time. I called someone to have our home blessed, hoping to rid our house of whatever presence had visited us. Thankfully, we never had any more problems after that, but even now, I can't help but wonder about that night. What was it that I saw? The most terrifying thing is that I know it was real, and I know it knew just how afraid I was. I lived in North Carolina for 35 years since I was 5. I met my husband here, and we've raised our family here for 22 years. When we first moved into our own home, we'd been married for 1 year, and I was pregnant with our first child. My husband left for work around 5:30 a.m. He's a lineman, so works early, and I laid in bed until around 8:30, trying to usually avoid falling into morning sickness. And while I laid in an empty house, on the verge of the very first morning, I could hear sounds in my kitchen. Cabinet doors opening and closing, boxes so carefully folded closed in that well-known puzzle corner over corner over corner were opening, and boxes shifting as though they were being emptied and things put in their place. I got out of bed expecting my husband, and there was no one to be found. No boxes amiss, no contents removed. Everything as it had been left the night before. I kind of decided I was maybe tired or crazy, even though I knew I was awake because I was nauseated and waiting for it to pass. Fast forward around 4 years, and we have 2 children. The girl we were expecting when we moved in, and a boy who surprised us only 14 months after the first. Everyone's asleep. It's around 4 a.m., and I am awoken to the sound of my almost 3-year-old and my 4-year-old quietly singing in the living room. I'm laying in my room listening and thinking, it's too early to start the day. I'm so tired. But when you have little ones, the day starts when they start. So I lay a few more minutes bargaining so that maybe they'll go back to sleep and accept my fate and use the restroom. And I put on my housecoat, and mind you, they haven't stopped singing since I woke up. I walk through my room, and as I pass through the kitchen, the singing stops immediately. As I'm walking into my empty living room, I see no one. That was odd. So I check on the kids in their room, and they're out cold, fast asleep. I look around and everything is in its place. The TV isn't on, no radio playing, just silence. I go back to bed. No reason to lose precious sleep when it's so hard to come by with the little ones. And as you can imagine, these events left me profoundly afraid. When I was 7, my family, consisting of my 2 older brothers of 13 and 15 and my mother, moved house. We moved to a street that was built on an old tram track from around the 1900s. The line of terrace properties themselves were fairly new. When we moved in, they were only around 15 years old. All of the properties have a rear garden that is divided by a meter-tall wooden fence. Each garden has a shared rear wall that is 7 feet tall and made of concrete. This wall separates the properties from the grounds of the local park, and this is all relevant information, I promise. As a kid, I kept myself entertained. The age gap between my brothers and myself was enough for me to be left out of things, and my parents were recently divorced. I would make up games and act out imaginary scenes. It was not uncommon to find me playing by myself in the back garden. We had pet rabbits that lived in a hutch that were up against the back wall mentioned earlier. Being the curious child that I was, I used to like standing on the hutch and looking over the wall into the park and people watch. I remember it being a warm night. The sun was setting a bit later in the day, but with the way the daylight plays out in my memory, it must be around 7 p.m. I was out in the garden, people watching from my rabbit hutch vantage point, when I had the sudden urge to look over my right shoulder. With the way my house is laid out, the kitchen is at the rear of the house, and if I were to enter the house, I'd open the door and walk through the kitchen, my neighbor's house, which would be on my right as I looked back. So I looked over my right shoulder, and my neighbor's back door is open. There are no lights on. It's dark in the sitting room, and I can't make anything out, but I know they have a sofa facing out, and it would be where I was looking. That's when I see 2 red dots, spaced apart and not changing distance from one another, floating in the middle of this black room. I remember squinting, trying to figure out what I'm seeing, and I kid you not, these two dots move in a smooth arc to the right and upwards, as if there were eyes on some kind of face standing from the sofa. As they move, they seem to get a bit closer to the door, and I can make out nothing except for a dark silhouette. I freak out and run back inside, all the way to the front of the house where our sitting room is located to tell my mum, and she assures me it's nothing, and I head back outside. I climb back onto the rabbit's hutch and immediately look behind me again. The figure with its red eyes is now standing in the doorway of their house, looking out into the garden. I nope once more back to the house, and this time I do not go back outside. For years I forgot about this experience, but I've always been afraid of the dark, and I especially hate looking out at the windows at night, particularly in the back garden. Something jogged my memory of it a few years ago, and every time I talk about it, it makes me want to cry, because it scared me so much. I still remember every damn detail of that evening, and I wonder what it was. My neighbors still live there, and I'm too afraid to ask them if they experienced anything, or if there's an explanation for what it was that I saw. This is my journey with the paranormal during my lifetime, and it all started in my childhood home of Jacksonville, Illinois. The following happened when I was in my mid-teens. I was home alone, not really doing anything in particular, when all of a sudden, I heard the front door opening. That was odd. I wasn't expecting anyone to be home at this hour, so I went and checked to see who had arrived. But when I reached the door, it wasn't open. I called out and inspected the house, and there was no one present. This, of course, left me very spooked, but it wasn't the only thing that happened in the house. There would be occasions every once in a while when I was home alone where I'd hear the stairs squeak, as if someone or something was walking up the stairs. Upon checking the house, I would find it vacant of other occupants, and I would resign myself to my room in the hopes of not hearing the sounds again. Skipping forward to when I turned 23, where we reached the horrible part in this story where my beloved mum passes away. This leads me down the path of alcohol and little to no sleep, at most getting 2 to 3 hours a night for about a month. Then one day randomly, I'm in that weird in-between sleep and waking state, and my mum fades in front of my face to say, "Goodbye, Evan. I love you." I say back to her, "Goodbye, Mum. I love you too." Then she starts to stand up and fades away, back to wherever she was in the afterlife. But that interaction finally brought me some peace of mind, and I could start sleeping again. Further down the line, I woke up out of a dead sleep. I was around 26, and I had to pee like a racehorse. So I get up and leave my room, but I'm stopped by an invisible force at my door. I look up and see a shadowy figure standing there, and in my head I ask, "What are you doing here?" And it responds, "Just checking on you." I reply, "Thanks, I'm doing okay." And it vanished. I felt like it was my grandfather who died in '03. This next part happened after I was married to my beautiful wife Megan. I was working for a mail delivery subcontractor that used semi-trucks to deliver the mail from point A to point B, and I was scheduled to work nights that week. So it's the middle of the day, my wife and I are both sound asleep, when I abruptly wake up, and hovering over me I see about 6 foot tall, skinny, completely white beings that looked like they were engaged in some kind of ritual over my body. I recall one of them squatting on my chest to make sure I was laying down, but I turned to see more and I realized I couldn't get back up. It was then that one put its hand on my face to gently put my head down and to fall back asleep, and I did. I didn't tell Megan about this until much later, because had she known, she probably would have never slept in the bed with me again. And for those questioning my sanity, I'm mentally sound. The doctor said I'm not crazy, But then again, I never told him about this. This happened between the ages of 3 and 5, between 1989 and 91. My room was on the complete opposite end of the house from my parents' bedroom. I'd wake up in the middle of the night on a regular basis, scared, and when I'd wake up, I'd remember seeing this woman standing at the end of my bed. I could kind of see through her, but she also put off a glow. It was a warm, loving, welcoming and peaceful glow. She was always wearing a blue tunic and a white headdress. She was always looking down, holding and happily comforting a baby wrapped in a blanket. And after a few seconds of having my eyes open, she'd noticed that I was awake and would act surprised like I wasn't supposed to see her, and then she'd be gone. I never felt threatened by her at all, but I remember the first time I saw her I didn't even know what to think. As I pulled my sheet over my head before she disappeared, she really did give off an aura that was comforting, welcoming, loving, peaceful and happy. The glow coming off her felt like that, like I knew I was completely safe while sleeping. This happened quite a few times, to the point I'd smile when I saw her after waking up, and she'd look back with a smile that was comforting, yet at the same time also conveying something like, "You aren't actually supposed to see me," while still intentionally let me see her for a few seconds before fading away. I would always be scared right after she'd vanish, because the safe feeling would go too, and I would want to run to my parents' bedroom. I could see my parents' bedroom from the doorway of my room, but you had to walk through the dining room and living room to get to it. There were always these strange shadow figures, dozens of them, walking around the dining room, kitchen and living room. I remember being so scared of them, but I never actually drew their attention while I stood there watching them from my bedroom doorway, and they never really noticed me or walked towards me. It seemed like they were in a hurry, walking with busy intent but never actually going anywhere. I was always scared of them, even more scared that I'd draw their attention, but I wanted the comfort of my parents. I was too scared to run through the shadow people that were walking around, and so I'd scream for my parents from my bedroom doorway. The instant I'd screamed, the shadow people would stop walking, and then all of them would look up towards me with an angry and frustrated aura, but never actually took a step towards me. They'd just disappear. One of the last times I saw the lady at the end of the bed and the shadow people, I wanted to get to my parents' room where they were, but instead of just calling out for them, I closed my eyes and held out my hands to feel my way across the dining room and living room to my parents' bedroom. I actually made it there on my own, even with my eyes closed. I could feel them there before they started to disappear, but I could also feel as they were fading away that they were angry because I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I stopped seeing them shortly after that, which is also around the time I started feeling more comfortable staying in my own bed all night by myself, without needing to have my parents nearby. But it's one of the most real and vivid memories that I can remember from that age, and I'm 38 now. This wasn't even an old house or anything that you'd usually associate as a stereotypical haunted place. It was actually a relatively new, double-wide trailer that my mum and dad had put there a few years before I was born. They brought the trailer brand new, direct from the manufacturer. I feel like what I saw and felt had to be real, because a 3 to 5-year-old wouldn't have been able to imagine that physical presence from her aura that was so welcoming, understanding and comforting, loving and peaceful, that the lady at the end of my bed gave off as she glowed. It was a distinct physical feeling that a 5-year-old wouldn't have been able to just randomly imagine, and a feeling that I somehow remember. I never saw anything like that again in that place, or any other place I've lived in for that matter. I'm a 40-year-old female, and this happened to me when I was 14 years old. During this time, I was being raised in a rural town in Washington's Pacific Northwest. Our house was in a heavily forested area with no close neighbors. I had multiple experiences at that house, but will share the one that has truly changed my life forever. One morning I woke up to see a little girl in my room. I woke up, but remained on my side, completely frozen in fear. This girl looked to be no older than 8 or 9 years old. She was wearing a light blue dress with spaghetti straps. It looked old and slightly tattered. Her skin was a pale white, almost grey-white in colour. Her hair was long and stringy, platinum blonde, and hanging loosely down to her elbows. Her body was emaciated. I could see her chest bones popping and her collarbone protruding more than it should. Her face was gaunt and her eyes were big. Her eyes were an extremely pale ice blue colour, so pale they were almost white. The girl was in the centre of my bedroom, just standing there, staring at me while I remained on my side. My eyes locked with hers, and I gasped for breath as she took a few steps towards me. I was already clutching my blankets at my chin, but at that second step towards me, I threw the blankets over my head. I stayed like that for what seemed like 20 minutes or so, not moving, trying so hard not to even move from breathing. Finally, I decided I would just look. I was trying to rationalize it in my head, telling myself it was just a waking dream and not real. I was being a baby. I slowly peeked from under my blanket. This girl was now no longer in the center of my room. She wasn't just a few steps closer. This girl was now mere inches from my face. She was staring at me with those huge, unblinking pale eyes. I could see now she had faint freckles on her face. She opened her mouth as if to say something to me. Her eyes were pleading, but I was utterly terrified. In this moment, I threw the blankets back over myself and trembled and cried and started to pray for her to go away. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, because when I woke, I told myself I was going to run for the bedroom door, and that is exactly what I did. I threw the blankets off and noticed the girl was gone. I ran out of my bedroom, and I had a hard time sleeping in that room after that. And it was not the last time I would see the girl. I saw her one more time after this, and it felt like she was trying to say something to me but couldn't. I was so scared at the time, and all I wanted was for her to leave me alone. Looking back now, I wish I hadn't reacted that way. Maybe she really did need help. This was my first paranormal experience, and the one that has stuck with me to this day. When I was around 9 or 10, I lived on a dirt road called Virgil Langford Road in Oconee County, Georgia. We lived in a house right next to the Langfords. I used to hang out with their kids, Amanda and Jeff, and always assumed they just owned all that land. Anyway, down the road, near where the Oconee connector is, now headed towards the Walmart where there used to be an old 2-story house that straight up looked like the house from the X-Files episode Home. All grey shingles, and it looked at least 100 years old, I'm sure. It was a spooky house the bus drove past. One day this guy moved in with 3 kids. I only remember one of their names was PJ, and we started hanging out, usually in the general area, but never in their spooky old house. One day a sleepover was arranged, and I went to spend the night with PJ in the spooky house. The yard was a mess, all overgrown. Half the lights inside didn't turn on, and random old junk had been littering that house from when they moved in. It was very dark, dusty and dank, and old-looking, and we were absolutely forbidden to go upstairs. PJ's dad had to work overnight, and my house was just a mile down the road, so it was just us 4 kids in the house. I asked PJ about upstairs, and he said he had never been up there, and he wouldn't go up there anyway because there are weird sounds. I didn't think much of it, and just assumed the little boy was just obeying Dad. He said it sounded like someone was walking around or dragging a bed, and when he heard it, they all just gathered in the main room. Of course, I didn't believe any of that, but the house was pretty spooky, so I didn't question it, as I would have if I were older. But sure enough, after being there a few hours, you could hear someone walking around upstairs. Stomps, creaks, thumps. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy bag across the floor and getting caught and bumping over loose boards. It even sounded like a few creaky old doors opened and closed. I was like, "No, dude, your dad must have come home." And he told me to look outside. His truck wasn't there. This only lasted for about 10 minutes, but it was pretty freaking weird. And I never went back to their house again. This happened when I was 9. My room didn't have a door, and I could see the staircase in front of me. On my left, it was just a wall, and on the right, it was my parents' and brother's room. I woke up during the night because I saw a really bright light coming from the staircase. I thought it was my dad, since he worked at night and I was used to seeing him at night. I suddenly saw this floating figure, and I freaked out. I'll always remember how freaked out I was. I was holding my teddy bear and said, "Who's that?" because I knew this thing wasn't my dad. It stared at me for a moment, and it left on the left side of the door where there's a wall. I wanted to reassure myself, telling myself it was my dad or brother, but I waited a bit, and the thing never walked down the stairs. It's like it walked through the wall. The next day I asked everyone casually if they'd seen them, and they all said no. My sister told me I'd probably had sleep paralysis, but I could move and talk. I was awake, I know it, but no one ever believed me. I even drew it in my diary. I unfortunately don't have it anymore, but it was a drawing of the thing that was freaking me out. I know this house is haunted. I would wake up during the night and hear footsteps and screams that no one else heard. And on nights where I would try to fall asleep, I could hear them coming from the attic. The footsteps plodding along at a rhythmic pace on the wooden boards that would keep me up. And of course, whenever we went into the attic to investigate, we'd never find anything there or a reasonable explanation for how the sound could be made, as there's no way an animal can mimic footsteps without being seen when you go upstairs. I was told it was just the wood, but I know when it's the wood, and I know when it's not. I remember one day I heard a scream and my blood ran cold. I thought someone had got murdered upstairs. When I asked in the morning, no one had heard it. I felt like I was crazy. I finally moved away and nothing happened anymore. My old house, I won't sleep there alone for anything in the world. It's the creepiest place I know. Back when I was living with my parents, the house that we lived in had weird stuff that happened. So, this was during the process of us moving out. Everything was packed, and that night I was out with some friends. We went back to the house and ended up hanging out for a bit. After a while, I walked with them to the bus stop not far away from the house. I had to go back there because I needed my luggage, as we were staying in a small hotel nearby for a few days. I entered the house and started going downstairs because my room was in the basement. I was walking down the steps and everything was normal. I went to my room, grabbed my luggage, and started walking towards the stairs again. I started walking up the stairs when I noticed a draft that was appearing to get stronger the more I continued walking up. I thought perhaps a window was open, but no, not a window or door or anything. The worst part was that once I was almost upstairs, I started hearing muffled voices that appeared to be coming from the living room and from the hallway to my left. I started panicking and ran out the house once I started hearing footsteps as well. I ran out, slammed the door shut, and locked the door and walked away as fast as possible. And luckily, I never had to go back. When I was 9, we moved into a house that I think was straight up evil, and we lived in it until I was 16. The entire family has experiences, from hearing our names called to being scratched, touched, pushed, and things that would throw themselves across the room. Babysitters would make me stay up with them as I was the oldest and never come back afterwards, Lights and water would come on in the whole house at the same time, on all floors. The local Catholic priest said that we were liars and wouldn't even come out to the house. We told the people who bought it, but they laughed at us. I heard they lived here for just 2 years. I got used to my people not believing us, but I'll never forget that house and how it affected me. My little brother saw some guy named Mr. Something or other, but I never did. I found an old picture of the dude that looked just like what my little brother described to my mum. He was about 4 or 5 at the time. He said, "Oh, Mr. Thing lives in the closet and keeps the other ones away." Yeah, I didn't go into their room very often. The creepy one for me was actually seeing something. The little house on the prairie looking girl looked right at me and walked through a wall. It scared the crap out of me. I couldn't have been more than 12 at the time. That was the only time I saw that kind of thing. Mostly we all saw black shadows in the house and just felt watched. Sometimes my blankets got pulled, and then my ankles, like it was straight from a horror movie. It was dark and hard to breathe in that house, and I hated being alone in it. To make it worse, it followed us to the next house a state away, because what are the chances of 2 different hauntings? It stopped when I was around 18. I haven't had too many other experiences like that since. I get that I must sound crazy, but man, it was real for us. My mom did some research but didn't find too much other than an old photo of the closet man. I don't want to ever return there. My partner and I recently bought a house in western Pennsylvania. The previous owner had passed away, so I was little worried about negative energy possibly sticking around, but he actually lived in a nursing home for a bit before he died. It was only a small relief. To start off, I want to say that I have a history of sensing things, not ghosts, but energy. I'm hyper-empathy, and sometimes people or events can have such a powerful energy that it can attach itself to things, and then I pick up on it. At least, that's what I've come to understand. I also have a history of hallucinations that are treated by medication, and I can tell the difference because my hallucinations are caused by intrusive thoughts and are always out of the corner of my eye and are always very clear. For instance, one time at work I saw a man standing next to a co-worker out of the corner of my eye, and I can tell you exactly what he was wearing because my mind made it up. When things happen in the house, however, it's vague, distressing, and dark. It started off small when we moved in a few months ago, little sounds here and there that everyone could hear. I often gauge the sounds I hear by how our cat responds to them. He hears them when I do, and looks up expectantly. One day when I was lying in bed, I heard what sounded like a knock on the bedroom door, except it sounded more like when you drop a marble on a hard surface. That really fast bouncing sound. It did that 3 times in a row, each going up in pitch. I never heard it before, and I haven't heard it since. Our second bedroom is the worst. It gives me the creeps even during the day. I had this feeling that whatever was making those noises in there, it was like it was trying to scare me for fun. I've seen a woman just by the side, briefly, in our kitchen. She had long strawberry blonde hair. We were home alone, and I don't know anyone of that description. About a month after that, I was again in our bedroom, and I saw an arm reach out from behind a curtain as if to grab something, and then retreat quickly. It was all black and very thin. I couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to cleanse the house. I brought some Palo Santo and desert sage, and burnt the Palo Santo first and opened the window in each room to usher the spirits out. For a while it seemed to work, and then I saw the hand again. This time almost orange, out, reaching from a curtain before disappearing. But it all culminated 2 nights ago when I woke up in the middle of the night, and something caught my eye. I looked over towards the window and saw a giant floating head of some kind, of an animal perhaps with a long snout, long wild hair and large horns. It was looking right at me. and it was totally black. I could only see features because of light coming through another curtain. I knew I was awake because I immediately tried to grasp what I was looking at and figure out if it was just my mind playing tricks. My dresser would have been behind this thing, so maybe something on the dresser is casting a weird shadow. But when I looked closer, it was blocking out all light from the dresser. Normally I can see my giant plushie there because it glows green even in the dark, but I couldn't see it. Only this head staring at me. I thought to myself that I was hallucinating. If I blink it will go away, but it didn't. It floated there for a few seconds silently, and then slowly began to disappear. I don't remember what happened after that because I instantly somehow fell back asleep. I never screamed or woke up my partner, and I think it's because I wasn't really scared, just intimidated, like it was trying to assert dominance. I'll be burning sage to assert more dominance, but I can never get that image of the creature out of my head. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed, feel free to follow the links in the description to listen to a few more stories. Huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. You guys are amazing. And if you want some more content, follow the links on screen now. Stay awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Good night.